Hello and welcome to this week's Swedish Facebook Live. I'm Mona Locke, Chief Communications Officer here at Swedish, and we're the largest nonprofit health system in Washington State with 5 campuses, more than 115 clinics, and 2 freestanding emergency departments. So we were on the forefront when COVID hit Seattle, and we thought it would be great to offer the public an opportunity to speak to our experts about what's going on and really get their questions answered in real time. So feel free to please ask your questions on our Facebook website, and we will try to ask them real time and get them answered by our experts. Today we have a pretty exciting topic for you, and I think it's one that's been covered in the news almost every single night and day. It's really about trials and possible treatments. And we have a great panel of experts for you, and I will let them introduce themselves. But let's start with Dr. Jason Goldman. And I'll start out with a question for Dr. Goldman, which is really why? What's the purpose of trials, and how does one get started? Dr. Goldman?
Thanks, Mona. Hi, my name's Jason Goldman. I'm an infectious disease doctor at Swedish Medical Center, and I work in infectious disease and organ transplant. To answer your question, Mona, we're doing trials here at Swedish because all treatments or potential treatments for COVID-19 are investigational. So we have sort of 2 categories of treatments. We have experimental that can only be given in the context of a clinical trial, and we have investigational agents that are considered off-label use. And that means that there's drugs that are available for other indications that are approved by the FDA. For instance, hydroxychloroquine for the use in malaria or rheumatoid arthritis, that can be used, quote, off-label and applied to patients with COVID-19. But still, even when we're using those approved medications, we don't know if they're safe and effective for COVID-19. So that's why it's so important to study this in clinical trials, so we really know that we're doing good and not harming people. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. And next, our panelist is Dr. Olivia Hegorova, who, if you could answer my question about how does a trial get started and what does it take to really put on a trial?
So good afternoon. My name is Olivia Hegorova. I'm a hematologist here at the Swedish Center for Blood Disorders and Stem Cell Transplantation. In terms of starting a trial, in the setting of COVID, there's really been a rapid interest to getting potential therapies, effective therapies up and running as quickly as possible. So there's been more of an expedited process. You have to start with a good idea, a plausible idea, and then we take that to a research steering committee that includes physicians and as well as an institutional review process or an IRB that includes members from the community, and everybody has to come together and say, do we think this is a good idea? Should we proceed with this? And then of course we, for my particular trial, we went through FDA approval to go ahead and give an investigational new drug approval to provide patients something that has not been given before. And fortunately, all of this, in the current situation is happening very quickly, so we can try to get patients therapies as soon as we can.
And Dr. Hegorova gave a sneak peek at her trial is really the convalescent plasma trial that you've seen in the news also, so we'll go to that a little bit later in the program. Next, our final panelist is one, I guess, doesn't really need an introduction in the Swedish world, as he's worked with the Cancer Institute for many years, but Dr. Hank Kaplan, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Hank Kaplan. I'm an oncologist at Swedish, and I've for many years been involved in clinical trials in the cancer world, and at this point I'm in a phase of my career transitioning into full-time research, and so I've been trying to bring my experience in clinical trials and taking compounds out of the lab into the clinic to bear on the COVID situation, so I've been helping out with a number of the COVID trials.
Thank you. And your question that I should follow up on is really, how does a trial end? Like, when do we know when it's reached fruition, and where do we go from there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as Jason and Livia have pointed out, this is really a somewhat crazy situation, not only for the world at large, but for us as medical researchers. There is such a need for instant data to find out whether what we're doing is useful or not. And so many potential therapies have been proposed as being useful. Our job is to figure out what actually is useful and what isn't. And depending on the kind of therapy that you are working with, you have to figure out, okay, what are the things that will tell us this is worth doing? Is it keeping people off respirators? Is it just survival? Is it improvement in the immune system? You have to agree what will prove that this will work. And then you have to figure out, because so many patients are so individually different from each other, just how many patients do you need to be certain whether something is working. So all of us, when we're putting these trials together, are working with epidemiologists, biostatisticians, so that we treat enough patients who are similar enough that we can come to an absolute conclusion. This isn't working, let's get rid of it and move on to something else, or this is great, we're going to adopt this. And once we adopt it, then that hopefully becomes available for everyone. The unique part of this situation is these kinds of things are usually carried out in routine situations over a number of many months or years. We need to compress all of this into weeks or a couple of months to get these answers. And so that's been a unique problem that everybody working in this area has to deal with.
Yeah, it's probably quite complicated, I think, in terms of coordinating it all and getting it stood up. So I want to go first of all to one of our hot topics is remdesivir. We actually, Dr. Goldman is heading up a trial on remdesivir, and in the news just last night and throughout the week, we've heard that there's some results out that say that remdesivir is not helpful. In fact, it may be hurtful in the fight against COVID-19. So Dr. Goldman, can you speak to the latest? And my question is, well, if one trial results are out, do we still work on this drug? Why is that important?
Yeah. So thanks so much, Mona, for those questions. And I did want to just add on to something Dr. Kaplan was saying. He mentioned the complexity of operating in the space of trying to do clinical research trial when there's so much going on. Things are changing, week to week and sometimes even day to day. And one thing that's been really inspiring to me is just as an infectious disease doctor, I felt that me and my colleagues in infectious disease were really front and center in this epidemic. But nevertheless, all the different specialties have really just piled in to help, and it's been such an amazing collaborative environment. I would say my colleagues in hematology and oncology, they've been amazing. Just their clinical trials experience and expertise in those areas has been so helpful. And pulmonary critical care, emergency, hospital medicine, really the list goes on and on of even our rheumatologist colleagues, they've all been sort of just jumping in to help in this fight against COVID-19. And that's been amazing. And to get to your question too about remdesivir and some of the stories in the media, I don't put too much stock actually in what comes out in the media. There's been lots of leaks all over the place about remdesivir and a lot of other things as well. I really don't think that we can put too much stock in the leaks. In my view, the media hasn't really been reporting on trials that are not officially published in responsible ways. So I think that that's a sort of a dangerous thing that builds on the hype of what's going on. Now I know people are desperate for cures, they're desperate to know if things are working or not, and that also feeds into the hysteria. But as Dr. Kaplan said, and many others at the NIH and the CDC and other places, we need to evaluate the science, and we can't make public policy based on media reports. So, did you have a question, Mona?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we have to be very careful about saying a therapy is not effective when there's a leak to the media. And just last week, there's a leak to the media that remdesivir was highly effective. This week, there's a leak to the media that it's not working. So to be honest, I don't trust either of these. I can't really say from what I've seen anecdotally if it works or not. I'm really waiting to see the science and to see the reports in the controlled trials.
Do we have a timeline on the remdesivir trial and when it would be completed?
Absolutely. So remdesivir was sort of the agent that was ready to go at the start of the COVID epidemic. Back in late February and early March, I had reached out to my contacts at Gilead and to other investigators across the nation, sort of hoping that we could bring remdesivir as a potential investigational treatment to our patients at Swedish. We were seeing cases of unexplained pneumonia in the emergency rooms and in intensive care units. So we had a feeling that this was COVID. That's what it turned out to be, and when we had our first confirmed cases, we were ready to jump on treating patients with remdesivir. So that was, almost, I think 7 or 8 weeks ago at this point. The trials for remdesivir are fully enrolled. The Gilead trials. We're in an extension phase, so we can still offer the medicine, but we still don't know if it's safe or effective. The data's locked, and we should be hearing results from the trials within a couple weeks. There's also a separate trial from the NIH that's also looking at remdesivir, and that one's also fully accrued. So I think we'll be hearing, real results that we can trust and evaluate the scientific integrity on as a whole community within a few weeks.
We'll be waiting with bated breath to hear those results. And another trial that we're working on that's also very prominent in the news is the hydroxychloroquine. There, I got it. And Dr. Kaplan is deeply involved with that. And last night, again, it was reported that it was ineffective and could be harmful. And so, Dr. Kaplan, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, this has probably had the most notoriety of any of the treatments that have been out there. And it's a very complicated area. This really started with a French study in a very small number of patients in which, again, as Jason says, was not a trial. They just tried it because hydroxychloroquine and its precursor chloroquine had been used for years to treat malaria. And there was some laboratory data to say that this class of drugs did have some antiviral activity in the laboratory. They had not reached the point of being clinically useful, but there was an appropriate reason to try them. And this French study came out, and literally in just a couple of dozen patients, suggesting that people cleared the virus faster if they had hydroxychloroquine. And then on top of that, some of those patients happened to get an antibiotic called azithromycin, which is a very commonly used antibiotic to treat lung infections. And they said it looked like the people who got both drugs may have cleared the virus even more quickly. So that's the face that launched 1,000 ships, really. And since that time, an enormous number of what we would call uncontrolled studies have come out. And it's been very much the same story as remdesivir. There have been studies that have come out suggesting that hydroxychloroquine is useful. There have been studies that have come out, including the VA study that was put out last night, saying it's not useful because of the data with azithromycin. Again, studies saying it may be useful, maybe not. That's a particularly difficult area because one of the problems with just taking hydroxychloroquine is it affects heart rhythm. And azithromycin can affect heart rhythm by the same mechanism. So there has been worry that combining those two drugs may create cardiac problems. And indeed, there are data coming out saying that is the case. There was a study from Brazil using chloroquine in which 20% of the patients had significant cardiac problems. And then finally, the last chunk on the hydroxychloroquine tree was this physician who got a lot of press in one of the suburbs from New York City, claiming that using those drugs combined with zinc, of all things, all of his patients were cured of COVID. Unfortunately, he didn't bother to prove that his patients had COVID, number one, and number two, again, it's just anecdotal information. So this is a very, very complicated area. There are studies still going on with combinations of all of those things. We here at Swedish are trying to get a study going with hydroxychloroquine and zinc. And the other variable here is when during the course of the illness you give it. I would make the distinction that between drugs that are being tried to ameliorate the toxicities of advancing disease, such as tocilizumab, which works on the inflammatory response created by the virus, versus therapies that try to kill the virus before it ever gets to that point. drugs like remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, and a few other things, the goal with those drugs is to never get to the point where we have to deal with people in lung failure. And so both of those things need to be going on at the same time. I think the fairest thing to say right now is, even at this point, with all the press it's gotten, we don't know how effective hydroxychloroquine is, what the right dose is, whether or not it's effective to combine it with other drugs.
Thank you, Doctor. And Dr. Hegorova, I want to go to the convalescent plasma treatment and trial that you have helped launch. And in partnership with BloodWorks Northwest, we're very lucky because I believe we're the only institution in this area, starting last week, was it, that we actually started working with patients on this. Can you tell us about this?
So this was all started by BloodWorks Northwest as well as the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic sought to get something called an emergency investigational new drug approval for convalescent plasma, so that they could give it under something called expanded access, so they could get it to patients quickly throughout the country. And at this point, as soon as we heard about it, I called Dr. Joyner, who's the lead primary investigator at Mayo Clinic, and said we want to participate. We signed up as soon as it was possible, and took it through our internal processes again to make sure that everybody in pulmonary critical care and infectious disease, that everybody was interested, and everybody was interested and on board. And so we were able to actually start administering convalescent plasma a couple weeks ago now, 2 weeks ago. So we've treated quite a large number of patients. In the larger scheme in the country, there's now been, as of today, about 1,700 patients that have received this treatment throughout the nation. And we're very excited to be able to be offering it here. As other sites are getting signed up for it, again, through our region, there's multiple sites that will be getting convalescent plasma, as well as through our Providence network with Providence St. Joseph Health. We made sure that any sites that were interested, that we would help them get get through the IRB processes. And so there are multiple sites now that are ready to go as well throughout the entire Providence St. Joe Health system. But given that BloodWorks Northwest has partnered with us and are collecting this plasma from donors, we were fortunate enough to have plasma ready to go and be able to give it to patients the last couple of weeks.
That's pretty exciting, and we're seeing progress with this.
So again, it's like Dr. Goldman and Dr. Kaplan have said, it's really too early to make conclusions. We don't want to make informal conclusions. We're very encouraged. We're cautiously optimistic about it. There's really good rationale for convalescent plasma from the historic use in other respiratory viral infections, such as the original SARS virus, influenza, the Spanish influenza, H1N1. It's been used in all those different settings, and there's anecdotal data from those settings that it is likely safe and effective. And so there's good historic precedent to be using it in this situation. But again, we want the hard data. We are waiting, and Mayo Clinic will be collecting, of course, this will be thousands of patients worth of data. So we really should have some good answers.
And one of the questions that came in says, this research seems to hold such promise. How do research projects like these get funded?
So this project is funded by BARDA, which is a federal organization that's funding the cost of the plasma unit themselves. Each plasma unit costs somewhere under $1,000. It's a complicated process to collect from donors. So you have to have a donor that has recovered from the infection at least 28 days symptom-free, and then is willing to come in. They have to pass the regular blood donation screening questionnaires, make sure they're healthy enough to donate, and then they have to come back and do a process called plasmapheresis, where they get an intravenous line and they get the plasma collected. And then that has to be processed, it has to be screened like any blood product is screened for infectious disease, make sure that that it's a safe product. And so that all takes a lot of time, energy, and money. And so fortunately, there's some funding for the units themselves, but you know, if anybody is interested or would like to fund and help, BloodWorks Northwest on their website, if you just if you search BloodWorks Northwest convalescent plasma, they have a link to either be a donor or a link to help fund the study. So that is extremely helpful, and we've had a lot of donors reaching out interested from our foundation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Mona. And this is Dr. Goldman. I wanted to just add on to what Dr. Hegorova was saying. I've gotten a lot of questions from family, from friends, from my patients. You know, what is convalescent plasma? And you know, I think that's really important to sort of understand, you know, what that is. So when we recover from an infection, oftentimes our immune system builds a response, and we develop something called antibodies, which are secreted by the immune cells, and they can attack you know, similar targets if, you know, they're seen again, or in this case, if we take the blood product from one person that has the antibodies and give it to someone else, those antibodies can attack the virus. So that's sort of the idea behind it. And as we've been hearing, there's so many interesting things about this viral infection that's really a lot different than a lot of other infections we know about. Dr. Kaplan talked about the immune response kind of going haywire and causing lung failure. That's something we're really trying to figure out. So also at Swedish, we have a very exciting study looking at the immunology of COVID-19. And we're partnering with ISB, which is the Institute for Systems Biology, and we're seeking volunteers to participate in this study and donate their blood samples so that we can better understand the immune system. There's a lot of interesting questions there. This is what we need to do to sort of help develop vaccines in this space, is to better understand the infection, and also to better understand really kind of promising therapies like Dr. Hegorova was talking about with convalescent plasma.
Dr. Kaplan, you had some comments?
I think what both Liv and Jason are saying is really critical. There are a lot of unique things to every different kind of infection, and you're also hearing lots of things about having everybody tested to see what their antibody levels are, to see what the prevalence of the disease in the community is. There's this enormous hope that we're going to develop what's called herd immunity, meaning that enough people will get the infection and recover from it and be therefore immune to getting it in the future. The reality is, right now, the reason we're all talking in hypothetical terms is we don't know yet exactly what kinds of antibodies people are going to create to this virus. We don't know whether they'll be useful in protecting other people, and we don't know what we'll need to develop this herd immunity so that the next time this virus comes around, it's not going to obliterate the population like it has now. These are all incredibly critical questions. The kinds of study that Jason just mentioned is going to be absolutely essential so that we understand not only does convalescent plasma work, but what are the implications for how our immune system works for the future about how all populations will do with this kind of infection.
And when you're talking about the immune system, and there's so much conversation also about antibody testing, is that on the horizon here?
Yeah, I can take that one, Mona. So antibody testing, we're hearing a lot about it in the news. Governor Cuomo in New York has talked a lot about it and is scaling up testing in a huge way in that state, where it's been sort of the most affected place within our country. In Seattle, we were the first, but thankfully, our epidemic didn't really take off like it did in New York. But in terms of sort of getting back to society, as Dr. Kaplan mentioned, and opening back up the economy, getting people out of isolating with their families, the antibody testing is going to be very, very important. Okay, where are we now with antibody testing? Right now, we have what are called first-generation tests. These aren't really performing that well. I've seen some preliminary results. There's nothing really definitive out there, but they look like they don't do a good enough job of deciding who's really seen the infection in the past and who hasn't seen the infection in the past. That's what the antibody tests can show. We're hopeful that a second generation of tests, which are coming around, there's a couple different ones in the pipeline that would be available by early May. These ones are likely to be functioning much better and working better to let us understand that question of, has an individual person who wants to go back to work already developed an immune response to COVID-19? And we're going to be scaling up testing here at Swedish also with our partners at Providence. We're going to start with healthcare worker screening, most likely. We're still sorting out the details of that project.
Yeah, there's a question on here really about transplants too, and how do these trials, would they impact transplant patients or?
Yeah, again, I can answer that one. I work with our solid organ transplant group here. Our hematology oncology colleagues, can also speak to the bone marrow transplant population. The solid organ transplant patients is a complex area, and patients who receive an organ from someone else to replace their own kidney, for instance, they go on immune suppressive therapies to help prevent rejection of that new organ. And we don't know what those therapies do, and we think of them usually as making someone more at risk for an infection, but in this situation, there could be a possible benefit to the immune suppressive therapies. They're somewhat similar to some of the treatments we're using for COVID-19. So our colleagues at University of Washington are doing a nationwide survey of COVID-positive solid organ transplant patients, and we're participating in that survey here at Swedish, and we should know some more about that soon, but right now that's still another big question. I don't know if Dr. Kaplan or Dr. Hegorova wants to talk about bone marrow transplant patients.
In terms of transplant patients, I think we just have to go back to prevention. In the clinic, we are trying to keep patients that are immunosuppressed out of the medical system as much as possible. So we are doing a significant amount of telemedicine visits and not having patients come in unless it's absolutely crucial that they have some laboratory test done or something tested. I telemeded with a couple of my bone marrow transplant patients last week, and they are very used to, from their transplant, they're very used to staying at home and wearing a mask and not going out in public into large crowds. So all of that is actually part of their usual routine as a post-transplant patient. And so I think they're prepared, and they already know how to do this. So they're being extra careful. And I think we've been fortunate enough that we haven't had our transplant patients really coming in with COVID, I think because they're used to being extra careful and staying at home.
Thank you. And we're running short on time, but I do want to throw this out there. We've talked a lot about how a lot of these trials have been out in the media, but you hear a lot of things, including the president was, I think yesterday, talking about injections and all these different types of remedies. I know we're looking for cures and that special cure. What would you say to the public out there?
I can start since again, I would just echo that, if you can prevent this in the first place, that is the best thing you can do. So really following, the CDC and our governors and our guidelines, they are working. We really saw after we instituted them, we did see an improvement. We saw a downtrend in cases, and so it is working, and it's very basic, but it's prevention is the best, the best possible option.
Okay, Dr. Kaplan?
Oh, I would agree entirely. I think we're really in a situation where not only is the public frustrated, we as physicians are frustrated not knowing exactly what to treat with. And, physicians are at first supposed to do no harm, and a number of these things that you see out in the media where people make the assumptions that they will do no harm, that isn't necessarily always the case. And I would go right back to what Liv says. I think the critical thing is to stay safe. It's hand washing, it's safe distancing, it's probably using masks, so even that is a little bit questionable in certain situations. Some things that people would assume are perfectly safe probably aren't. The goal here is prevention until we have effective treatments for this.
Dr. Goldman, final words?
Yeah, I think I would echo what Dr. Kaplan and Dr. Hegorova said about prevention, hand hygiene, distancing, physical distancing. But in this situation where you or your loved one does develop COVID-19, I think to think about all the treatments are really experimental. So anything that anyone today would be offering you is an experimental therapy. Oftentimes we hear from some of our patients that they're scared about enrolling in a trial. A trial actually has extra levels of safety monitoring. So that's, at this point today, the safest way to get treatment for COVID-19. I think not enrolling in a trial is always an option, and to go supportive care. And that's really the standard of care right now, is to just do supportive treatments. But I can encourage people to think about the trials as really a way to help access safe treatment or potentially safe treatment in the safest way possible, and at the same time contribute to our societal's understanding of how we can treat this infection.
Thank you, doctors. That was all great advice and interesting information today. And as you said, the curve is flattening here in Seattle, and we feel very fortunate. And if you missed it, we did a video live tour of our intensive care unit at Issaquah. So it's on our Facebook site if you want to see that from last week. And the best advice you guys gave really was obviously stay home, stay healthy, stay safe, and we hope to continue that flattening and that we don't see a resurgence. So again, on behalf of Swedish, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.